A mobster insulted Sammy Davis Jr. with a racial slur during Dean Martin's show. Dean's six-word response made the mafia never return. The Sands Hotel, August 1963, 3 in the morning. And the real party was just getting started. Dean's public show had ended hours ago. But now, in the private lounge on the casino's top floor, the Rat Pack was in full swing. Frank was at the piano. Sammy was doing impressions. Joey was mixing drinks. And Dean was holding court, cigarette in one hand, scotch in the other, making everyone laugh without even trying. This wasn't open to the public. This was the inner circle, studio executives. A couple of senators, high rollers, who dropped six figures at the tables. And because this was Vegas in 1963, a handful of connected guys, mob associates, who helped keep the city running smoothly, guys who ensured that problems disappeared and money flowed. At a corner table sat a man we'll call Angelo Marchetti. Big Angelo, they called him. Chicago outfit, mid-level but climbing. He was in Vegas on business, the kind of business that didn't get written down. Angelo was loud, brash, the kind of guy who thought volume equaled importance. He'd been drinking since noon, and 16 hours of booze had turned him from obnoxious to dangerous. Dean didn't like Angelo, but he tolerated him. That's how Vegas worked. You smiled at people you didn't respect, because respect and likability weren't the same thing in this town. As long as Angelo kept his money flowing and his mouth relatively shut, they could coexist. But tonight, Angelo's mouth wasn't staying shut. Sammy was in the middle of a bit, doing his impression of Jimmy Stewart meeting a flying saucer. The room was howling. Even the stone-faced guys from Chicago were cracking smiles. Sammy had that gift. He could make anyone laugh. He could make you forget, for a moment, that the world outside was ugly and complicated. When Sammy finished, the room erupted in applause. Frank whistled. Dean raised his glass. Ladies and gentlemen, Sammy Davis Jr., the hardest working man in show business who still can't get a cab in this town. It was a joke with an edge. A reference to the racism Sammy faced every single day. But coming from Dean, it wasn't mean. It was acknowledgement. It was Dean's way of saying, I see what they do to you, and it's garbage. Sammy grinned and took a bow. He was used to Dean's humor. They'd been friends for years. Brothers, really. Dean didn't care that Sammy was black. Dean didn't care that Sammy was Jewish. Dean cared that Sammy was talented, loyal, and genuine. That was enough. That's when Angelo decided to open his mouth. Yeah, well, what do you expect? Angelo's voice cut through the laughter like a knife through silk. That's what happens when you let and then he said it. The word, the ugliest word in the American language, the word that carries centuries of hate and violence in 6 letters. The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. The kind of silence that happens when everyone stops breathing at the same time. Frank's hands froze on the piano keys. Joey's drink stopped halfway to his mouth. The senators looked at their shoes. The studio executives suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. Sammy stood in the middle of the room, his smile still frozen on his face like it hadn't gotten the message yet that everything had just changed. His eyes found Angelo's face, then dropped to the floor. Sammy had heard that word 1,000 times before. From people in the street, from hotel clerks who wouldn't give him a room, from cops who pulled him over for driving while black. But hearing it here, in Dean's private space, from a guest at Dean's party, hit different. Dean didn't move. He stood exactly where he'd been, drink in hand, cigarette burning down to his fingers. But something in his face changed. The easy smile disappeared. The relaxed posture tightened. If you knew Dean, you knew this was the dangerous Dean. The Dean from Steubenville, who'd grown up fighting. The Dean who dealt cards in illegal gambling dens, where violence was just business. The Dean who understood power and when to use it. Angelo, too drunk or too stupid to read the room, kept talking. Come on, Dino. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. The kid's good, don't get me wrong. But let's not pretend. Stop talking. Dean's voice wasn't loud. It was quiet, soft, even. But it carried a weight that made grown men flinch. Angelo looked confused. What? I'm just joking around. No harm meant. Dean set his drink down on the nearest table. Carefully. deliberately. The glass made a soft clink that somehow sounded louder than Angelo's voice had been. Dean stubbed out his cigarette in an ashtray. Then he walked toward Angelo's table. The room held its breath. Frank stood up from the piano bench, ready to intervene if necessary. But he didn't move. Nobody moved. They just watched Dean cross the room with the slow, purposeful walk of a man who'd made a decision. Dean stopped directly in front of Angelo's table. He didn't sit. He didn't lean down. He just stood there, looking down at Angelo, who suddenly seemed very small despite his 250-pound frame. "Stand up," Dean said. Angelo laughed nervously. "Dino, come on, what's the big deal? It's just us guys here. No need to get all, stand up." Angelo stood. He was taller than Dean by 2 inches and outweighed him by 60 pounds. But in that moment, with Dean staring at him with those cold brown eyes, Angelo looked like a child caught doing something shameful. Dean leaned in close. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just close enough that only Angelo could hear what came next. But the room was so quiet that the microphone Sammy had been using, still hot and sitting on the piano, picked up every word. 6 words. That's all Dean said. 6 words that would become legend. Get out and never come back. Angelo blinked. "What? Dean? I was just..." Dean didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. "Get out and never come back. Not to this party. Not to this hotel. Not to this city. You're done in Vegas." "You can't do that," Angelo said. But there was no conviction in his voice. "I've got business here. I've got connections. You can't just..." "I can. And I am." Dean turned to address the room, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man just disrespected my friend. My brother, in my house, at my party. That makes it my business, and in my business, there's no room for that kind of hate." Dean looked at the 2 other Chicago guys at Angelo's table. "You 2 can stay if you keep your mouths shut and your money on the tables. But him," Dean pointed at Angelo. "He's finished. If I see him in this casino, this hotel or this city after tonight, I'll make a phone call, and you all know who I'll call." The threat hung in the air. Everyone knew who Dean meant. Sam Gankana. The boss. The man who ran Chicago and had his fingers in Vegas. The man who respected Dean Martin more than he respected his own captains. Dean and Sam were friends. Real friends. And if Dean called Sam to say that Angelo Marchetti had disrespected the Rat Pack, Angelo wouldn't just be banned from Vegas. He'd be answering questions in a basement somewhere. Angelo's face went white. "Dean, please. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just drunk and stupid. I apologize." Dean turned back to Angelo. "You don't apologize to me. I'm not the one you hurt." Dean pointed at Sammy, who was still standing in the middle of the room, trying to process what was happening. "You apologize to him. And then you leave. And you never come back." Angelo looked at Sammy. For a moment it seemed like his pride might win, like he might refuse. But Dean's stare was heavy, and the silence in the room was heavier, and Angelo realized he had no cards left to play. He walked over to Sammy. His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I was out of line." Sammy looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once. He didn't smile, didn't offer his hand, just nodded. That was enough. Angelo walked out of the room with his head down. His 2 associates stayed exactly where they were, not moving, not speaking, making it very clear that Angelo had acted alone and they wanted no part of it. The moment the door closed behind Angelo, the room exhaled. It was like someone had released a pressure valve. But nobody started talking. Nobody went back to drinking or laughing. They all just looked at Dean, waiting to see what would happen next. Dean walked over to Sammy and put his arm around his shoulders. "You okay?" Sammy nodded, but his eyes were wet. Yeah, I'm okay." "No, you're not. And that's okay too." Dean pulled him into a hug. Not a brief, manly pat on the back. A real hug. The kind that says, "I've got you and you're safe here." When they pulled apart, Dean addressed the room again. "Let me make something crystal clear to everyone here. Sammy Davis Jr. is my brother. Not my colleague. Not my co-star. My brother. And anyone who disrespects him disrespects me. Anyone who uses that word in my presence, at my show, in my city, is choosing to make an enemy of me. And trust me, you don't want that." He looked at the senators. "You gentlemen understand." They nodded quickly. He looked at the studio executives. "You boys clear?" More nodding. He looked at Angelo's two associates. "We good?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Martin," one of them said. Dean picked up his drink. "Good. Now let's get back to having a good time. Frank, play something happy. Joey, make the drinks stronger. Sammy, do the Sinatra impression, the one where he can't hit the high notes." The room laughed, nervously at first, then more genuinely. Frank started playing, Joey started mixing, and Sammy, after taking a deep breath, launched into an impression of Frank that had everyone howling. But something had shifted. Everyone in that room had just learned something about Dean Martin. They'd learned that the cool exterior and the easygoing charm weren't the whole picture. They'd learned that Dean had lines you didn't cross. And they'd learned that loyalty mattered more to him than money, more than connections, more than keeping the peace. Angelo Marchetti never came back to Vegas. Not to perform. Not to gamble. Not even to pass through. Word spread through the outfit that Angelo had been blackballed by Dean Martin himself, and when you were blackballed by Dean in Vegas, you were radioactive. Casino bosses wouldn't let you through the door. Hotel managers suddenly had no rooms available. Even the Chicago guys stopped inviting him to meetings held in Nevada. A year later, Angelo was transferred to Milwaukee, a nothing assignment, a place where he counted money and ran numbers and never got close to the action again. His career in the outfit peaked the night he opened his mouth in Dean's private lounge, and it was all downhill from there. For Sammy, the moment became something he'd reference for the rest of his life. In interviews, he'd talk about Dean's loyalty. "Dean didn't just speak up for me. He put his reputation on the line. He made an enemy of dangerous people to defend my dignity. That's not just friendship. That's love." Years later, in 1988, Sammy was diagnosed with throat cancer. The prognosis was grim. He'd spent a lifetime smoking and drinking, and now his body was giving out. Dean came to visit him in the hospital. By then, Dean was struggling too. His son had died in a plane crash. His health was failing. He was a shadow of the man he'd been. The two old friends sat in Sammy's hospital room, not saying much, just being together. Finally, Sammy spoke. "You remember that night with Angelo?" Dean nodded. "Yeah, I remember. That was the night I knew," Sammy said. "Knew what?" "That I mattered. Sid. Not as an entertainer, not as talent, but as a person. You risked real consequences to stand up for me. Nobody had ever done that before." Dean's eyes got misty. "You're my brother Smokey. Brothers protect each other." Sammy smiled. "I love you, man. I love you too." Sammy passed away in 1990. Dean died 5 years later, in 1995. But the story of that August night in 1963 lived on. It became part of the Rat Pack legend, part of the Dean Martin mythology. Those 6 words, "Get out and never come back," became a symbol. A reminder that real power isn't about how much money you control or how much fear you inspire. Real power is knowing when to use it and having the courage to use it for the right reasons. Dean Martin could have laughed along with Angelo's joke, could have ignored it to keep the peace, could have pulled Angelo aside privately and handled it quietly. But he didn't. He made it public. He made it clear. He drew a line in the sand and dared anyone to cross it. Because that's what love does. It doesn't stay silent when someone you care about is hurting. It doesn't calculate the cost of standing up. It doesn't worry about making enemies. It just acts. The lesson isn't complicated. We all face moments where we have to choose between comfort and courage, between keeping the peace and doing what's right, between staying quiet and speaking up. Dean Martin chose courage. He chose right. He chose to speak up, and in doing so, he showed everyone in that room, everyone in Vegas, and everyone who's heard this story since, what it really means to have power. It means using it to protect people who need protection. It means drawing lines that shouldn't be crossed. It means making it clear that hate has no place in your house, at your party, in your life. 6 words. That's all it took. Get out and never come back. But those 6 words, contained everything you need to know about Dean Martin, not Dean Martin, the entertainer, not Dean Martin, the legend, Dean Martin, the man, the friend, the brother, the guy who understood that the coolest thing you can ever be is warm when someone needs warmth, strong when someone needs strength, loyal when someone needs loyalty. That's the real magic of Dean Martin. And that night, in August 1963, in a private lounge at the Sands Hotel, with the weight of racism hanging in the air and a friend's dignity on the line, Dean showed everyone exactly what kind of magic he possessed.